He booked a palace for his mistress and called it a business trip. The only thing he did not plan for was the fact that his wife had been the real power in his life all along. At 47, Jonathan Reed had climbed high enough in Chicago's financial world that people stopped asking how, and started assuming he deserved it. As a senior vice president at a prestige investment firm, he lived behind tinted glass and polished marble, speaking in numbers that made other men nervous. His suits were tailored to silence wrinkles and objections. His watch flashed like a private warning time belonged to him. Colleagues smiled too quickly, assistants moved too fast, and clients leaned in as if listening to a prophet. Jonathan carried himself like a man who had never been told no, and the city seemed eager to confirm his illusion. Elizabeth Reed was the last person in his life who still told him no, but she did it without words. At 44, she moved through their penthouse with a calm grace that made the space feel expensive even when the lights were off. She hosted charity dinners with soft precision-remembered names Jonathan forgot, and raised their children with a steadiness that looked to him like passivity. He called her quiet. He called her predictable. He called her his anchor, but only in the way a man praises a thing for staying where he left it. He never asked what she wanted. He never asked what she knew. He saw her as an elegant background to the life he displayed. Then Madison Clark walked into his office with a smile that promised noise. She was 27, a junior analyst in mergers and acquisitions, sharp-eyed and hungry in a way that made Jonathan feel young without making him feel threatened. Madison looked at him like he was the answer to every question she had ever been afraid to ask. When he spoke, she listened as if he were teaching her the world. When he touched her hand, she acted as if it were a gift. Jonathan told himself the affair was not betrayal, but proof. Proof he still mattered. Proof he was still desired. Proof he was not trapped inside the polished, quiet life Elizabeth kept running so flawlessly. He planned the weekend like he planned hostile takeovers with precision and arrogance. The Aurelian Crown, a legendary 5-star hotel in the heart of the city. The presidential suite, a private elevator, champagne waiting on ice. He told Madison the staff would treat them like royalty, and her eyes widened exactly the way he wanted. He told his driver. He told his assistant. He told himself this was control. For Elizabeth, he prepared a lie dressed in professionalism. New York, urgent meetings, limited signal, no calls. He even packed a briefcase with papers he would never open, amused by the theater of it. Elizabeth folded his shirts with careful hands and did not ask a single question. She checked his medication, reminded him to drink water, and kissed him goodbye with the same composed tenderness she had offered for years. Jonathan took her silence as surrender. He mistook her calm for ignorance. As he walked out, he felt a brief prickle of discomfort, not guilt, just the irritation of being reminded that he was still tethered to someone who did not applaud him. He dismissed it the way he dismissed everything that did not serve him. After the door closed, Elizabeth stood still for a moment, listening to the apartment settle into quiet. Her face did not break. Her eyes did not blur. She moved to the window and looked down at the city, the lights burning like ambition beneath winter glass. Somewhere out there, Jonathan believed he was stepping into a weekend where rules did not reach him. Elizabeth exhaled slowly, as if setting something heavy down at last, and the silence around her changed. It no longer felt like absence. It felt like patience, the kind that waits for the exact right moment to become undeniable. Jonathan Reed told himself the affair was not about desire, but momentum. That was how he justified it, as he sat across from Madison Clark in a quiet corner restaurant near the river, watching her talk with her hands, her eyes bright with admiration. She was 27 and still believed success was romantic, that power was earned through brilliance alone. When she laughed, she leaned forward as if the world were opening for her, and Jonathan felt the familiar surge of importance. With Madison, he was not the man who had already won. He was the man still being discovered, still impressive, still necessary. Madison spoke about work as if it were a promise rather than a burden. She asked questions Jonathan's peers stopped asking years ago, the kind that made him explain himself instead of defend himself. He liked that. He liked how she listened when he talked about acquisitions and leverage, how she nodded as if every decision he made carried weight far beyond spreadsheets. When he reached across the table and touched her wrist, she inhaled sharply as if startled by the intimacy. That reaction mattered to him more than he cared to admit. It reminded him that there were still parts of him capable of disrupting someone else's balance. He revealed the plan, slowly savoring her anticipation. A weekend away, discreet and perfect. The Aurelian crown. Madison froze for a moment, then smiled in disbelief. The hotel existed in her world as rumor and fantasy, a place whispered about in lifestyle articles and executive gossip. Jonathan enjoyed watching her process. It enjoyed the way her excitement made his generosity feel like dominance. He told her about the private elevator, the soundproofed walls, the presidential suite reserved for people who never waited in line. He did not say the words out loud, but they both understood what he was offering. Not just luxury, but access. To Elizabeth, he offered nothing new. The lie was familiar, rehearsed, dressed in urgency and responsibility. New York. Emergency meetings. Limited availability. He spoke with calm authority, already halfway gone. Elizabeth listened without interrupting her expression, neutral, her questions practical rather than probing. Jonathan mistook her composure for indifference and felt strangely relieved by it. He wanted her to stay exactly as she was, unchanging and manageable, while he pursued a version of himself that felt louder and more alive. He did not consider the possibility that silence could be a choice rather than a default. The night before his departure, Jonathan packed carefully. Suits for meetings that would never happen. Documents filled with numbers that meant nothing outside their performance. He slipped his watch into its case and checked his reflection, adjusting his tie with practiced confidence. Elizabeth moved around the bedroom, folding and sorting her presents, steady and efficient. She reminded him about his medication, asked if he preferred the blue or gray coat. Jonathan answered absently, distracted by the thrill of secrecy. He told himself that deception was necessary, that men like him lived in compartments. He never questioned who had built those compartments in the first place. Madison texted him late, unable to sleep. Jonathan smiled at the message, imagining her restlessness, her impatience. He responded with assurances, with promises that felt generous and controlled. He did not mention Elizabeth. He did not need to. In his mind, his wife and his mistress occupied entirely different realities, separated by class, by ambition, by relevance. He believed he had arranged his life like a chessboard, every piece positioned for his advantage. The idea that someone else might be moving pieces without his knowledge never occurred to him. When morning came, Jonathan left early. Elizabeth stood by the door, her hand resting lightly on the frame, watching him adjust his coat. He kissed her cheek and thanked her for everything, the words vague enough to mean nothing. She wished him a safe trip and watched him disappear down the hall. Only after the door closed did she allow herself a moment of stillness. Somewhere between patience and resolve, something inside her settled. Jonathan believed he was walking into a weekend of indulgence. Elizabeth knew he was walking into a place that already knew her name. Jonathan arrived at the Aurelian crown believing he had entered a sanctuary built for men like him. The car slowed beneath the arched entrance, and before the engine fully settled, a uniformed attendant opened his door with a practiced bow. The city noise fell away as if muted by design. Jonathan stepped onto polished stone and felt the familiar surge of belonging. This was not a hotel to him. It was confirmation. Madison emerged beside him, momentarily stunned by the scale of the place her excitement barely contained. Jonathan noticed and smiled, pleased by the contrast between her awe and his composure. Inside the lobby rose like a cathedral to wealth. Marble floors reflected golden light. Conversations drifted in hushed tones, deliberate and discreet. Jonathan walked with unhurried confidence, his presence signaling that he did not need directions. When he announced his name at the front desk, the receptionist's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, respect sharpening into attention. The presidential suite, she confirmed. Everything prepared. Champagne chilled. A private elevator waiting. Jonathan accepted the keycard without thanks, accustomed to being accommodated rather than acknowledged. Madison watched him as if he were a magician, and he felt taller for it. The suite itself exceeded even Jonathan's expectations. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline like a possession. Plush furniture absorbed sound. The city existed outside the glass, distant and obedient. Madison spun slowly, taking it in, laughing under her breath as if afraid the moment might break if she spoke too loudly. Jonathan poured champagne and raised his glass, toasting the weekend with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He believed he had escaped the rules that governed ordinary lives. In this room, high above consequence, he was untouchable. He told himself this was freedom, not betrayal. The hours blurred into indulgence. They ordered food without glancing at prices, drank until the edges of the world softened, and let the suite swallow time whole. Jonathan felt lighter than he had in years, his responsibilities dissolving into the velvet quiet of luxury. Madison listened as he spoke about his career, his victories, his rivals. She touched his arm at the right moments, her admiration effortless and open. With her, he did not need to explain himself. He did not need to justify the compromises that had shaped him. He was simply impressive, and that was enough. That night, as Madison slept, Jonathan stood by the window alone, watching the city pulse below. For a fleeting moment, Elizabeth crossed his mind, folding laundry in the penthouse, moving through her routines with that same calm efficiency. The thought irritated him. He pushed it away, reminding himself that she was safe, contained, unaware. This was his space now. His time. He had earned it. He returned to bed, convinced that compartmentalization was the same as control. Morning arrived quietly. Sunlight filtered through heavy curtains, casting the room in soft gold. Jonathan rose early, feeling restored, and crossed into the marble bathroom. Steam fogged the air as he stepped into a robe waiting on the rack. The fabric was impossibly soft, heavy with quality. As he adjusted the collar, his gaze caught on a small detail stitched near the lapel. 2 letters intertwined in elegant thread. E and H. The sight paused him. He stared longer than necessary, his fingers brushing the embroidery as if it might explain itself. At first, he dismissed it as branding some old European flourish meant to imply heritage. Still, the letters lingered in his mind as he returned to the suite. When breakfast arrived, he noticed the same initials embossed on the stationery beneath the silver tray. Later, he saw them again on the edge of a linen napkin, subtle but deliberate. The repetition unsettled him in a way he could not immediately name. The room remained flawless, the service impeccable, yet something had shifted. A faint dissonance beneath the perfection. Jonathan laughed it off when Madison asked if anything was wrong. He blamed the markets, the habit of overthinking. But as the day wore on, the initials followed him like a whisper he could not quite hear. He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself the world did not hide secrets from men like him, And yet beneath the luxury and indulgence, a thin thread of unease tightened, unnoticed but unbroken, waiting to be pulled. The unease Jonathan felt refused to fade, no matter how much luxury surrounded him. It followed him like a shadow, as the afternoon stretched on, subtle but persistent, slipping into moments that should have been effortless. Madison lounged on the sofa, scrolling through photos she had taken but would never post her excitement, still bright, still untouched by doubt. Jonathan watched her and felt an unexpected distance. The suite was flawless, yet something about it felt less like an escape, and more like a space that already knew him too well. He noticed the initials again while pouring himself a drink, E and H engraved discreetly at the corner of the crystal decanter. Elegant, intentional, not the kind of branding a hotel used casually. Jonathan frowned his mind, rifling through possibilities. Old family names, founders long dead, European tradition. He told himself it was nothing but the thought refused to settle. He had built his career on reading details others ignored, on sensing shifts before they became disasters. This felt like that instinct, faint but insistent tapping at the back of his skull. When the butler arrived to refresh the room, Jonathan decided to ask. He kept his tone light conversational, as if the question were idle curiosity. The man paused just long enough to be noticeable before answering. "Ownership, sir." A long, standing mark. The words were polite, precise, and entirely unhelpful. The pause lingered after he left hanging in the air like a half-finished sentence. Jonathan replayed it in his mind, irritation sharpening into suspicion. People hesitated around power. That hesitation meant something. He tried to distract himself with excess. A late lunch ordered without restraint. Expensive wine opened too early. Madison laughed easily, unaware of the shift beneath Jonathan's composure. She talked about the future, about promotions, about the kind of life she imagined for herself. Jonathan nodded, but his attention drifted. His thoughts circled a name he had not spoken aloud in years. Elizabeth Harper, his wife's maiden name. He had always dismissed it as a remnant of a family whose wealth had faded into respectable obscurity. Old money without teeth, tradition without leverage. The realization struck him abruptly, sharp enough to steal his breath. E and H, Elizabeth Harper. He laughed out loud, startling Madison. The sound came out brittle, forced. It was absurd. Coincidence stacked on coincidence. Harper was a common name. Hotels used initials all the time. His mind was reaching inventing threats where none existed. He had spent too many years in boardrooms reading enemies into silence. This was indulgence, not strategy. He told himself to let it go. But the thought would not release him. He remembered Elizabeth's father, Thomas Harper, a man Jonathan had quietly underestimated from the moment they met. Polite, reserved, fond of talking about legacy and standards. Jonathan had found him irrelevant, a relic from an era where wealth was inherited rather than engineered. He remembered vague mentions of hospitality investments, boutique properties that Jonathan had never bothered to research. Too small to matter, too slow to compete. Or so he had assumed. The suite seemed to tighten around him as evening approached. The city outside glowed with promise, but Jonathan felt increasingly disconnected from it. He checked his phone, half expecting a message from Elizabeth, something sharp or suspicious. There was nothing. Her silence, once comforting, now felt deliberate. He wondered for the first time what she did with her days beyond the roles he had assigned her. He wondered how much of her life had existed outside his field of vision. When Madison suggested another dinner at the hotel restaurant, Jonathan agreed quickly, eager for the distraction. He dressed with care, choosing a suit that projected control. In the mirror, he studied his reflection, searching for cracks. He saw confidence, experience, authority. He did not see a man on the edge of being exposed. Yet, as they left the suite, the initials caught his eye one last time, stitched into the carpet near the door, subtle and inescapable. Jonathan stepped over them, without knowing why, a faint sense of dread settling into place, as if he had crossed a threshold he could not uncross. The restaurant fell quiet the moment Elizabeth Reed stepped inside, though no one could have said exactly why. It was not an abrupt silence, not the kind that draws attention to itself, but a subtle recalibration, like a room instinctively straightening its posture. Jonathan noticed it immediately. He was mid-sentence, speaking to Madison about a deal he had closed months ago when the air shifted and his words thinned into nothing. He looked up, irritation already forming, prepared to resent the interruption. Then he saw her. Elizabeth did not look like the woman he had left behind in their penthouse. She moved with a measured confidence that commanded space without demanding it. Her dark suit was tailored with surgical precision, the kind worn by people who did not dress to impress, but to assert. Her hair was swept back cleanly, revealing a face composed and unreadable. She was flanked by two men who walked half a step behind her, deferential in a way Jonathan had only ever seen directed at true authority. One of them he recognized instantly. Henry Wallace, corporate litigation legend. The man people called when entire empires were about to bleed. Jonathan's chest tightened. His first instinct was denial. This was coincidence layered on paranoia. Chicago was not small, but it was not impossible either. Elizabeth had charity events, boards, committees. She belonged in rooms like this. He told himself that even as his pulse began to climb. Madison followed his gaze, confusion knitting her brow as she turned slowly in her seat. She saw Elizabeth, then looked back at Jonathan, searching his face for context he could not give her. Elizabeth's eyes swept the room with calm efficiency, cataloging faces, assessing dynamics, until they landed on Jonathan. There was no shock in her expression, no flicker of surprise. Only recognition, cool and deliberate. The look passed over Madison without pause, as if she were no more than an accessory out of place. Jonathan felt suddenly exposed, pinned in his chair by a gaze that did not accuse, but understood. That understanding was far more dangerous. Elizabeth walked toward their table. Each step landed with quiet certainty, heels clicking softly against polished floor. Conversations around them died entirely now. Forks hovered midair, glasses froze halfway to lips. Jonathan became aware of the weight of attention pressing in from all sides, a sensation he had always enjoyed, now sharpened into something humiliating. Madison shifted beside him, her hand tightening on the edge of the table, her earlier excitement draining into visible fear. Elizabeth stopped beside them and looked directly at Jonathan. Up close, he noticed the details he had ignored for years. The steadiness of her breathing, the absence of hesitation. The way her presence seemed to bend the space around her, drawing authority inward rather than projecting it outward. When she spoke, her voice was calm, level, unmistakably final. "Jonathan," she said, "I believe you are sitting at my table." The words struck harder than any accusation could have. They carried no emotion, no raised volume, no need for explanation. Jonathan opened his mouth instinctively, reaching for charm, for dominance, for anything that might reassert control. Nothing came. The carefully constructed narrative of his life fractured in that moment, the compartments collapsing into one another. He felt Madison's eyes on him, pleading, terrified, demanding answers he did not have. Jonathan managed a weak smile, his voice faltering as he spoke her name. "Elizabeth." "What are you doing here?" He gestured vaguely, the question dissolving even as he asked it. Elizabeth tilted her head slightly, a gesture that might have been curiosity in another context but here felt like assessment. She glanced briefly at the empty chair across from Jonathan, then back at him. "I canceled my evening plans," she said. "Something more important required my attention." Her gaze returned to Madison, dismissive and brief. "A guest?" she added softly. Jonathan felt the floor drop beneath him, as the implications stacked too quickly to ignore. The initials, the silence, the hesitation of the staff, the way the room itself had responded to her entrance. Elizabeth Harper Reed, the woman he had reduced to a supporting role in his own story, stood before him not as a wife confronting betrayal, but as an owner reclaiming what had always been hers. Elizabeth did not raise her voice, but the room leaned toward her as if sound itself wanted to listen. Jonathan felt the weight of years collapse into the space between them, every assumption he had ever made about his wife shattering under the calm certainty in her posture. She placed one hand lightly on the back of the empty chair, not to sit, but to claim it, and the gesture carried more authority than any threat. The two men behind her remained still, their presence quiet but unmistakable, the kind of stillness that existed only when power was settled and unquestioned. Jonathan tried to speak again, to frame the moment as misunderstanding, coincidence, anything that allowed him to remain upright. His throat tightened, the words refusing to assemble. Elizabeth watched him with a steady gaze that held neither anger nor pain, only clarity. That absence of emotion unsettled him more than rage ever could. This was not a wife confronting infidelity. This was a decision being executed. Madison sat frozen beside him, her face pale, her earlier confidence erased by the tension pressing in from all sides. Elizabeth finally spoke again, her tone precise, each word measured. "Let me clarify something for you, Jonathan." Her eyes never left his. "My father, Thomas Harper, founded Harper Hospitality Group more than half a century ago. He built it property by property, city by city, with patience and discipline. The Aurelian crown was his masterpiece, the standard by which the rest were judged. When he passed, his controlling interest did not go to a board, a trust, or a committee. It came to me." The silence thickened, the restaurant suspended in collective disbelief. Jonathan's mind raced, grasping for details he had ignored, conversations he had half listened to, moments he had dismissed as irrelevant. Elizabeth continued unfazed. "For years I allowed others to manage the day-to-day operations. I chose a quiet life. I chose to raise our children. I chose to be your wife." She paused, and for the first time Jonathan saw something flicker in her eyes, not weakness. Resolve tempered by disappointment. "I trusted the structure my father left behind, and I trusted you." The pause ended. Her voice sharpened. "As of last week, I dissolved that structure. I assumed my rightful role as sole chair and owner of Harper Hospitality Group. This hotel, and every decision made within it, answers to me." The realization hit Jonathan with physical force. The initials, the staff, the deference, the hesitation. Every sign he had ignored aligned into brutal clarity. He was not in neutral territory. He was standing in the center of his wife's empire exposed. Elizabeth turned her attention to Madison. "Miss Clark," she said evenly, "you are employed by the same firm as my husband. Your relationship violates your company's ethics policy. Your employment has been terminated effective immediately." Madison gasped, her hands trembling as she looked to Jonathan for help that did not come. Elizabeth's words were not cruel. They were administrative, final. She returned her gaze to Jonathan before he could respond. "As for you," she continued, "the joint accounts you have been managing are now frozen. The funds originate from my family's holdings. The penthouse is no longer accessible to you. Your belongings are being packed and transferred to your office." She reached into her bag and placed a document on the table between his wineglass and plate. "Divorce papers. My terms are clear. You will sign them. You will leave with what you brought into this marriage. Nothing more." Jonathan stared at the paper, his reflection warped in the polished surface of the table. The man he had been moments ago felt distant, almost fictional. He looked up at Elizabeth, searching for the woman he thought he knew. What he found instead was someone complete, self-possessed, and finished with him. Around them, the restaurant remained silent, every witness absorbing the lesson unfolding in real time. Elizabeth straightened her business, concluded. Jonathan Reed had not lost a marriage. He had lost access to a world he never truly understood. Jonathan Reed did not stand up when Elizabeth walked away. He could not. His body remained locked in place, as if the chair had become an anchor, and the floor beneath him had turned to ice. Across the table, the divorce papers lay like a verdict. The restaurant's silence did not feel respectful. It felt clinical, like an operating room waiting for the first incision. Madison's breath came in short, shallow pulls, the kind of breathing that belonged to panic. She stared at Jonathan as if he were someone she had never met, someone who had promised safety and delivered collapse. "My job," she whispered, and the words were small but sharp. "You said everything was under control." Jonathan tried to answer. His mouth opened. Nothing came out that sounded like certainty. His mind kept replaying Elizabeth's voice, the calm precision, the way she had spoken his destruction into existence without raising a finger. He had spent his entire career believing power was loud, believing it had to announce itself. Now he understood what Elizabeth had meant with her silence all these years. It had never been helplessness. It had been restraint. 2 security guards appeared at the edge of the table, not aggressive, just to present their posture, making the request inevitable. The maitre d' approached with a face tightened into professional regret. "Miss," he said softly to Madison, "if you would come with us." Madison's eyes darted from the guards to Jonathan, begging him to intervene, to say this was a mistake, to do something that would restore her world. Jonathan could not meet her gaze. He could not even pretend. The man she had clung to for advantage was suddenly weightless, stripped of every mechanism that made him valuable. Humiliated, Madison rose, her hands shaking as she grabbed her clutch. Her red dress, once a statement, now looked like a warning. She allowed herself to be escorted away, head down, mascara beginning to run. Jonathan watched her go and felt no guilt, only a hollow nausea. He had been performing control for her, and now the performance had ended. The audience was still watching. A leather bill folder landed on the table with a soft thud. "Your bill, Mr. Reed." Jonathan opened it and stared at the total. It was obscene, the kind of number meant to remind guests that luxury always had teeth. Under normal circumstances, he would have laughed and signed without thinking. Tonight, his hands trembled as he reached for his wallet. He slid his black card across the table, relying on habit more than confidence. The maitre d' returned less than a minute later. His expression had shifted from regret to discomfort. "I'm very sorry, sir. The card has been declined." Jonathan blinked, certain he had misheard. Declined. Run it again. He tried to keep his voice firm, but it cracked at the edges. Again, "Sir, it has been declined." Jonathan's cheeks burned. He pulled out another card, then another. Each time the same answer: declined, suspended, unauthorized. Around him, the room began to breathe again, the silence breaking into murmurs that sounded like judgment. People were no longer pretending not to watch. He was no longer one of them. He was entertainment. The general manager approached, no longer deferential, his tone turning official. "Mr. Reed, if you cannot provide payment, we will have to involve the authorities. Theft of services is a serious matter." The words pressed against Jonathan's throat like a collar. He, who had moved fortunes with a phone call, stood cornered over a dinner bill. That was the kind of humiliation that rewired a man's identity. He looked around, searching for an ally. There were none. His world had been built on status, and status had abandoned him. Henry Wallace reappeared at the edge of the dining room, moving with unhurried authority. He spoke quietly to the manager, then turned toward Jonathan with the detachment of someone delivering paperwork. "Mrs. Reed has offered to settle the bill. It will be deducted from any remaining consideration in your divorce settlement. Consider it her final courtesy." He slid a pen toward Jonathan and nudged the divorce papers forward. "I suggest you sign now." Jonathan stared at the pen. He had signed contracts worth hundreds of millions with a steady hand. Now his fingers shook as he picked it up. The signature he wrote was thin and uneven, a scrawl that looked like it belonged to someone else. When the ink dried, something inside him did too. He had no leverage, no audience, no escape route. Only the consequences he had laughed at for years. 10 minutes later, security escorted him through the hotel like a stranger. The lobby that had welcomed him now felt hostile, every polished surface reflecting his disgrace. Staff members avoided his eyes or looked through him with careful neutrality. He rode the private elevator up to the suite one last time and found his belongings tossed into a suitcase with brisk indifference. His expensive watch, his cufflinks, his neatly folded shirts all shoved together like they no longer deserved respect. The room that had felt like a palace now felt like a holding cell. When he stepped back onto the curb outside, the air had turned cold and wet. Rain misted down, clinging to his suit. His car was gone. Towed, he assumed registered in Elizabeth's name, just as everything else had been without him noticing. He reached for his phone to call a ride, only to remember the app was linked to his canceled cards. He stood there, soaked and blinking under the hotel's ornate canopy, watching limousines glide past as if the world had never known him. He began to walk. Each step away from the entrance felt like a step out of his old life. By the time he found a payphone, his shoes were wet and his hands were numb. He called the only person he could think of, a junior partner named Daniel, who had once owed him a favor. Daniel answered on the third ring, his voice strained from the start. "Jonathan," he said, "I just got an email from the board. Emergency meeting Monday morning. They're invoking the morals clause. Wallace sent them everything, photos, records. They're going to fire you." Jonathan's grip loosened. The receiver slipped from his hand and clattered against metal. For a long moment he stared at the payphone as if it had betrayed him. Then he looked up at the skyline, at the distant glow of the suite's windows high above. He had flown too close to the sun, believing it belonged to him. He had never realized the sun had a name, Elizabeth Reed. And now, in the cold rain, Jonathan Reed began the long, irreversible fall. 6 months later, the city no longer spoke Jonathan Reed's name out loud. It existed only as a cautionary whisper, a reference used by younger analysts when ambition drifted too close to arrogance. The markets had moved on as they always did, and Jonathan had been left behind with the debris of a life that once felt immovable. The man who had once dictated terms from glass offices now lived in a narrow apartment 3 floors above a street that never slept, its noise pressing through thin walls at all hours. Sirens replaced silence. Neon replaced skyline. The view from his window was a brick wall streaked with old rain and newer graffiti. His days had become small. He worked at a minor financial services firm with a name so generic it felt deliberately cruel, a place where his past inspired curiosity at best and quiet satisfaction at worst. His desk was a cubicle beneath flickering lights, his tasks repetitive and mindless. The younger manager who supervised him spoke with forced politeness, fully aware of who Jonathan had been and what he had lost. Every instruction felt like a reminder. Every ignored suggestion felt like erasure. Jonathan complied because he had no choice. Pride did not pay rent. Evenings were worse. He came home to silence that was not patient, not purposeful, but hollow. He ate alone, drank cheap whiskey that burned without comfort, and scrolled through messages that never arrived. Friends from his former life stopped returning calls. Some offered brief condolences before distancing themselves, others vanished entirely. Power, he learned too late, had been the only language they shared. Without it, he was suddenly illiterate. While Jonathan sank quietly, Elizabeth rose with deliberate grace. As chairwoman of Harper Hospitality Group, she stepped into a role she had been preparing for long before anyone noticed. The boardroom responded to her not with surprise, but with relief. She spoke with clarity, listened with intent, and dismantled inefficiency without apology. The years she had spent observing underestimated and overlooked had sharpened her instincts. She announced initiatives focused on sustainability, long-term growth, and ethical leadership plans that balanced profit with legacy. Resistance dissolved under preparation. Arguments collapsed under data. Harper Hospitality did not just stabilize, it expanded. At home, Elizabeth's life changed too. The penthouse no longer felt like a showroom for someone else's success. It became a place of warmth and presence. She attended her children's school events, helped with homework, listened without distraction. Laughter returned to rooms that had once been carefully staged and emotionally vacant. She was no longer performing a role. She was inhabiting her own life fully and unapologetically. Jonathan saw her again one evening at a newsstand near the subway. Her face stared back at him from the cover of a business magazine, composed and unmistakably powerful. The headline spoke of reinvention of a quiet heiress who had reshaped a global empire. He bought the magazine with the last cash in his pocket and carried it home like a confession. The article praised her vision, her leadership, her balance of strength and restraint. When it mentioned her personal life, it did so briefly. An amicable divorce, a focus on family and purpose. Jonathan Reed was not named. He was not condemned. He was simply absent. That absence hurt more than any public humiliation. He was not the villain of her story. He was not even a footnote. He was an error corrected and moved past. Jonathan closed the magazine and sat in the dim light of his apartment, understanding settling in with brutal clarity. He had never truly seen Elizabeth. He had mistaken quiet for weakness, patience for dependency, restraint for irrelevance. He had believed power needed to be loud because he needed it to be seen. Elizabeth had never needed that. He stood and looked out at the wall across from his window, its surface indifferent and unyielding. Somewhere else in the city, Elizabeth stood at the top of a tower bearing her family's name, looking out over a skyline that answered to her decisions. She had not taken revenge. She had taken responsibility. The difference mattered. Jonathan understood now, far too late, that the most dangerous people were not those who demanded attention, but those who waited, those who listened, those who chose their moment with care. He had thought he was the sun around which everything revolved. In truth, he had been a passing shadow mistaken for permanence because no one had corrected him sooner. As night settled over the city, Elizabeth Harper Reed moved forward into a future she had always owned. And Jonathan Reed, stripped of illusion and entitlement, remained where he was finally learning the lesson that cost him everything. The person you underestimate most is often the one holding all the cards. From a psychological and strategic perspective, this story is not about betrayal or revenge. It is about power asymmetry created by assumption. Jonathan did not fall because he cheated. He fell because he stopped observing, stopped listening, and replaced understanding with entitlement. Elizabeth represents a form of authority that experts often recognize too late quiet power accumulated through patience, preparation, and restraint. Real influence does not announce itself. It waits until it is undeniable. The most dangerous mistake leaders make is believing silence equals weakness. In reality, silence often means someone is watching, learning, and choosing the perfect moment to act. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more stories that explore power psychology and human blind spots through dramatic storytelling. And I am curious to hear from you. In the comments, leave the phrase, "Quiet Power," and tell us what moment changed everything for you.